Kucharski, the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Perry Kincaid and Barry Mayer, for the opportunity to talk to you today. It's also an honor to share the virtual stage with Consul General Liu and Gary Marr, whom I've known for many years, as well as Gordon Holden and Mr. Zhang. Today, my presentation will focus on the role of energy resources in the unfolding energy transition and discuss how energy security plays a critical role in helping sustain economic growth in the Indo-Pacific. In some of the climate change narratives we hear, it's often assumed that non-renewable resource development and use will need to decline in a carbon-constrained future. While this might be true in a more general sense, it's a simplistic notion, and I'd like to challenge that assumption by demonstrating that while fossil fuel demand will trend downward as we move through the energy transition, oil and gas, with abatement technologies like CCS, will remain significant in the global energy mix even in 2050. Before I get into specific energy products, I think it's important to review the demand outlook for oil, gas, and other energy resources from now till 2050. 2050 is a key date because this is the date that is now being used to define the timeline of the transition to a carbon neutral world. So the COP26 Climate Summit ended with some significant accomplishments, including a pledge by countries to strengthen emissions reduction targets. There were some shortcomings as well. Global energy supply will largely be shaped by climate change policies and the level of investment in new and existing resource projects. In the short term, oil will see an increase in demand over the short to medium term. And the IEA, that's the International Energy Agency, is forecasting that by 2025, it'll be 3.5 million barrels a day over and above the 2019 level of 100 million barrels a day. The longer term is less certain. Projections of global energy demand over the next several decades are highly dependent on the underlying scenario and the set of assumptions used. So the IEA's most recent World Energy Outlook that came out in October includes three main scenarios. I don't have time to go into each one in detail, so I'll summarize by saying that the net zero scenario is the most ambitious, while the STEPS scenario assumes policies in place leading up to COP26 are fully implemented. The announced policy scenario is the middle road scenario and takes into account all of the climate commitments made by governments globally up to October 2021. This is a scenario I'll primarily rely on mostly in this presentation. I think it's the most realistic one. So a pathway that leads to a 1.8 degree increase, and this is what the IEA announced would be achievable based on what was agreed to at COP26. That implies a level of annual average oil and gas spending falling somewhere between $295 and $495 billion. Given the above, it would be prudent and realistic to assume oil demand in 2050 will most likely fall somewhere between the levels implied in the net zero and the announced policy scenario. So that means, like you can see on this graph, somewhere between 24 and 75 million barrels a day by 2050. And again, currently the world is using around 100 million barrels a day. Looking at natural gas demand is likely to fall less than oil because it's important as a transition fuel for phasing out coal, but also as a backup for renewable generation. Similar to oil, it would be realistic to assume natural gas demand in 2050 will most likely fall somewhere between the levels implied in the net zero and the APS scenario. So between 1,747 and 4,004 billion cubic meters by 2050. Looking at total primary energy supply in the world and comparing the energy mix in 2020, so that's the bar on the left, with the one anticipated under the announced policy scenario in 2050, that's the bar on the right, we can see some profound changes. First of all, the share of fossil fuels in the global energy mix declines from about 80% today to around 50% in 2050. At the same time, renewables share grows from about 12% today to 37% by 2050. Of course, the world must continue strong efforts reducing greenhouse gas emissions from hydrocarbon use over the next 30 years. But the most realistic scenario is one that acknowledges that oil and gas, with abatement technologies, of course, will retain a significant share of primary energy demand even in 2050 and perhaps beyond. So looking at the regional breakdown of energy demand in 2050, you can see from this map that the Asia-Pacific region is expected to be the largest by far, and its share of global demand is set to steadily increase. So in 2020, the Asia-Pacific region accounted for about 43% of global total final consumption, followed by North America with 18% and Europe with 14%. But looking at the longer term, which is the map here in 2050, the outlook for demand by region indicates the Indo-Pacific region will account for about 52% of primary energy demand by 2050. Okay, so let's look at some specific energy resource opportunities. As the world drives to reduce emissions and decarbonize the global economy, we'll need all types of fuels to ensure that we maintain energy security and energy affordability while sustaining economic growth. The recent energy commodity shortages and price spikes experienced around the world show that cutting off oil and gas production and investment does nothing to reduce demand for these fuels. It only reduces energy security and raises prices at the gas pump. Most countries in the Indo-Pacific realize this all-of-the-above approach to energy sources will be critical over the transition, and that's why there's a focus there on fuel source diversification. I've already discussed the demand for oil and natural gas. The list I'm showing here now represents a large proportion of other fuels and minerals that will be important sources of energy over the next 30 years and beyond. And all of them are showing signs of growth in global demand. First, talk about critical minerals. Critical minerals are essential to the clean energy transition. Since their supply is limited and restricted to certain countries and regions, these minerals are also of strategic value. Canada and other countries have developed critical mineral lists, and Canada's list has 31 minerals on it, including rare earth elements. Certain critical minerals are essential to clean technologies like wind turbines, solar cells, and batteries. Future demand for critical minerals depends on the path of the transition, but the IEA estimates that even under current policies, demand for CRMs are expected to triple by 2050. They could increase 6 times compared to current demand under more stringent climate change policies. Lithium is expected to see the fastest growth, about 100 times its current level through to 2050. And the size of the global copper market could increase 60% by 2050. Given the increasing importance of critical minerals to the clean energy transition, access to and the reliability of supplies are a geopolitical concern. Canada, the US, and its allies are working to develop and strengthen critical mineral supply chains and to provide alternative sources of supply to China, which is currently the dominant player in rare earth elements and some other critical minerals. Okay, uranium. The prospects for global nuclear power industry have improved over the last 2 years because of decarbonization efforts. Of course, we all know that nuclear power is carbon-free. So this is driving an increase in demand for uranium that could be unmet if new mines are not developed soon. World nuclear generating capacity is forecast to double by 2050 under the International Atomic Energy Agency's high case scenario. Under that scenario, nuclear energy could contribute about 12% of global electricity by 2050. This obviously has a follow-on impact on uranium demand, which also is expected to increase to 79,000 million tons in 2030, up from 62,500 in 2021, according to the World Nuclear Association. Hydrogen is a versatile energy carrier, which can help to tackle various critical energy challenges. Nearly all the hydrogen consumed in North America is used by industry for refining petroleum, treating metals, producing fertilizer, and processing foods. Hydrogen has multiple applications in the clean energy transition. It can be used in fuel cells for stationary power supplies, in larger power generation facilities, or in transportation like buses, automobiles, and ships. In power generation, hydrogen is one of the leading options for storing renewable energy, and hydrogen and ammonia can be used in gas turbines to increase power system flexibility. There's ongoing plans in Canada's national and provincial hydrogen roadmaps to produce blue and green hydrogen for export offshore, including to the Indo-Pacific, where hydrogen use is expected to grow, especially in Japan and China, where there are ambitious plans to ramp up clean hydrogen production and or imports to help reduce emissions. Ammonia, this is a really interesting one and a really exciting new emerging opportunity, particularly in Alberta. Ammonia is a carrier of hydrogen, and since it can be transported at ambient temperatures, it's much easier to ship over long distances than pure hydrogen. Therefore, a lot of research is now going into the use of ammonia as a fuel. Ammonia generates no carbon dioxide when burned and can be blended with coal to reduce emissions at coal-burning power plants. Japan is at the forefront of fuel ammonia use currently. By 2030, Japan forecasts that it will import 3 million tons of clean ammonia, with demand rising to 30 million tons by 2050. At this point, it's difficult to estimate global demand for fuel ammonia because it's a new application. Most ammonia right now is being used as fertilizer, but the market's almost certain to increase rapidly. To secure these supplies, Japanese companies are now making investments in various countries, including Canada. In fact, Japan's Itochu Corporation and Malaysian state energy company Petronas are working together and have proposed a $1.3 billion ammonia plant in Alberta that would start up in 2023 and manufacture ammonia from natural gas extracted from a field owned by Petronas and produce up to 1 million tons a year. Itochu plans to ship the fuel to Japan, which will help Japan meet its emissions cutting goals. Okay, liquid petroleum gas, or LP gas. Some of you may know that AltaGas built Ridley Island Propane Export Terminal. It's Canada's first propane export facility. It's located near Prince Rupert, BC. Liquid propane is shipped to Ridley from BC and Alberta, and then it's cooled and loaded onto large gas carrier ships for export. The terminal provides Canada's natural gas producers direct access to international markets and a 15-day shipping advantage versus the US Gulf Coast. Prince Rupert is the closest North American terminal to Asian markets, and it's also the closest propane terminal to Sydney, Australia. So you can see Ridley gives Canada a huge advantage in the Indo-Pacific for propane. Virtually all the propane from Ridley is shipped to Japan. With the completion of Ridley Terminal in 2019, LP gas shipments to Japan increased from 0 to $316 million in 2019 to $455 million in 2020. Okay, other liquid fuels. Biofuels in the form of ethanol or wood pellets and other liquid fuels like methanol, synthetic fuels are another area that are likely to see future growth. Globally, just under 2 million barrels of biofuels were used in 2020, but volumes are probably going to double or even triple by 2030, depending on the scenario. Demand for wood pellets is growing globally. Japan imports wood pellets from Canada now. Most of Canada's fuel ethanol exports, however, go to the US. Finally, coal. Metallurgical coal is currently Canada's largest energy resource export to the Indo-Pacific, it playing an important role in the region's steelmaking industry. With the cost and technical challenges associated with producing green steel from electricity or hydrogen, demand for met coal is expected to remain strong over the next couple of decades. More than 80% of coal demand today comes from countries that do not have net zero pledges or aim to only reduce emissions after 2030. I'm thinking here of China and India in particular. And their demand is expected to increase through to 2030. Both India and China rely on thermal coal for a majority of their electricity generation, and the average age of coal plants there are only around 14 years. So they have probably a good 20 years to go in their useful life. Okay, let's talk about Canada's energy stake in the
We got about 5 minutes, Jeff.
Yep. So turning to Canada's energy trade, Canada exported 6.7 billion in energy resources, roughly 10% of our total exports to the Indo-Pacific. Overall, Indo-Pacific represented about 60% of Canada's non-US global energy exports, making it the most important market outside the US. The 5 top destinations were Japan, South Korea, China, India, and Taiwan. Those 5 customers account for 96% of our total energy exports to the region. Japan is the largest energy resource customer for Canada outside the US. Canada's energy exports to Japan accounted for 17% of our total exports to Japan. Canada's critical mineral exports to the Indo-Pacific were 5.88 billion in 2019, and exports to those 5 top countries account for 80% of total CRM exports to the region. By 2025, Canada should have in place a total export capacity of about 890,000 barrels a day of crude oil and 16.1 MPTA of LNG if all projects that have been approved are operating. I'm thinking here, of course, of the TMX pipeline expansion and the LNG Canada project on BC's west coast. For the purposes of putting these export volumes into perspective, I've reflected Canada's export potential in terms of current Japanese demand for oil and LNG, and also China. For example, if all of Canada's LNG exports were to go to China, Canada could satisfy about 30% of China's imports from all countries. Similarly, if Canada shipped all its crude oil imports to Japan, we would fulfill about 15% of all of Japan's crude oil imports. Of course, not all Canada's exports will go to China or Japan, and it's always good to have diversified markets. But this gives you an idea of the significant size of our exports that we're going to be having here in the next 2 or 3 years. Even at lower levels, energy exports from Canada would help diversify import sources and lower political and transportation risks for those countries, because these shipments would be traveling over safe and secure North Pacific maritime routes. Replacing imports from higher risk, lower ESG ranked countries would also contribute to meeting Japan's climate change goals and those of other countries in the Indo-Pacific. In the final analysis, energy security will be enhanced as a result. This slide estimates the value of Canadian oil and gas exports to the Indo-Pacific once all those projects begin exporting. Based on the output of two LNG projects on the West Coast, I estimate LNG exports could be valued between $6.5 and $12.5 billion annually, depending on commodity prices. Based on roughly 60% of the TMX expansion project being exported offshore, I estimate that crude oil exports could be valued at between $12 and $21 billion annually, adding significant amounts to Canada's exports to the region. In total, Canada could be earning as much as $18 to $33 billion annually by 2025 from these exports. This amount is about half of the total value of Canada's merchandise exports to the whole of the Indo-Pacific at the moment. So it's potentially a very significant opportunity for Canada. So in conclusion, I hope I've demonstrated that oil and gas will continue to be in demand in the region, even to 2050 and beyond, and that Canada will soon be in a position to meet a portion of this demand. Canada should use its energy and critical mineral resources strategically to support global and regional energy security in the Indo-Pacific as the world moves through an energy transition that is expected to last several decades. As Gordon mentioned, trade and security issues are linked. If recent events are any lesson for Canada, it's that Canada needs to diversify its trade, not only with the US, but also with China. We need to reduce the risk of being subject to economic coercion from any country, and so it's important to have diverse and balanced trade relationships. Resource-poor countries in the Indo-Pacific are best supplied from stable, reliable partners such as Canada that have strict ESG frameworks in place. Overall, looking ahead for Canada, I think outside the US, our biggest energy export opportunities will be in Japan, South Korea, China, India, and Taiwan. Japan will probably remain our largest export market because of the diversity of energy products going there, and also because it's the closest Indo-Pacific market to Canada and offers Japan enhanced energy security benefits over shipments of energy products through the South China Sea. Japan and Canada have also recently signed a broad energy cooperation agreement that will see the two countries cooperate more closely on energy and critical minerals, as well as investment. South Korea and Taiwan will also be important for similar reasons as Japan. China is less dependent on energy imports than Japan or South Korea, and also has a policy of self-sufficiency in some areas like hydrogen, which would limit our ammonia and hydrogen export potential there. They also have access to pipeline gas from Russia and oil from Central Asia. India will remain important for metallurgical coal and uranium and some critical minerals going forward. Anyway, thank you very much for your attention, and I welcome any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. I would be remiss if I didn't comment on the chat room discussions that are both to me privately as well as publicly. Eric Newell has spoken on the issue of CCS and what can be done with technology that's here in Canada, the combination of CCS and natural gas that can help China meet its goals with respect to GHGs. Jeff, let me say this: saying that energy is good, it's emissions that are bad. And so I think there's a lot of people who ask the question, should we have a fossil energy free future? And that's the wrong question. The right question, I think, is, should we have an emissions free energy future? And I think that's the more appropriate question to ask. Would you want to comment on that as it relates to the region that you've talked about?
Yeah, Gary, that's a great question. And I totally agree with that sentiment. I mean, it's not, we have to have this all of the above approach to energy sources, because as we're seeing, if we cut off oil and gas too soon or too quickly, it destabilizes the energy situation. We end up with what we've just seen the last few months: shortages in supplies, spikes in prices, and that's no good for the economy. So what we need to do is manage this transition and have stable, reliable supply. So energy security is really important. So you're right, it's all about low emissions, whether those emissions come from renewables or from fossil fuels. We're still going to need fossil fuels, if not just for transportation, also for industrial use, because there aren't good substitutes for many uses in the industrial sector. So it's just a reality. As much as we might want to get to net zero quickly, it's going to happen easier if we use carbon capture and storage and other technologies. And so that's what I always say as well. It's all about low emissions, and that includes nuclear, because some environmental activists insist that nuclear shouldn't be an option, even when it's zero carbon emitting. And I violently disagree with that. We're going to need nuclear as well.
I think what's interesting about that is there's lots of people that will tell you what they don't want, but they don't tell you what the alternatives are. So in the state of California, they've got scheduled the shutdown of the El Diablo nuclear power plant, which provides a lot of electrons for the state of California, but nobody has said where those electrons are going to come from once the scheduled shutdown of that is going to be in 2022. We've got about 3 or 4 minutes before we are expired at our time.
The comments on nuclear may be a good wrap up at this point, because it does bring forth the issue of and the opportunity for technology to play a role in addressing one of the more serious issues on an economic and on an environmental level, which of course is climate change. So let me make, oh, go ahead. Eric, you want to make a comment?
Yeah, very careful. The way we approach climate change and that it's all as nation states. And so what we have to make sure is our domestic policies don't get in the way of global realities, global opportunities. And the classic for me is what happened to our LNG projects in BC. We had 16 of them. They all disappeared. We lost that market. And we don't want to, we seem to, as a country, not want to go there because it's going to raise our Canadian emissions. But if we were sending those to displace coal in Japan and China and India, probably globally, it would be one of the best greenhouse gas reduction projects going. And so, you know, I think we got to be really careful here, especially in Canada with our vast natural resources and our great technology. We got so much opportunity to be a real positive factor that we shouldn't just focus on our miserable little 1.5% emissions in Canada. Probably the biggest opportunities are in supplying the minerals and LNG exports and things like that, and our technology. And I wrote the comment in there because I worked a lot on that agreement that Gordon Holden talked about between Tsinghua University and the University of Alberta on clean coal, because it also included carbon capture and storage. And I was surprised. I was a little disappointed, Gordon, that we weren't able to move that forward as quickly as we could, because Tsinghua picked the University of Alberta as one of 5 partners worldwide, and they were wanting to focus in on clean coal technology and carbon capture and storage. And quite frankly, I think that could be the biggest input or biggest contribution Canada could make.
Eric, I think you've made a great point, Eric, that GHG emissions don't recognize geopolitical boundary.
Exactly.
There's one global atmosphere.
Yeah.
And this is one of the weaknesses of Article 6 of the Paris Accord, is the inability for Canada to get credit for efforts that it makes to reducing GHG emissions in other parts of the world. We are now at 20 to the hour. Perry, I turn it back to you for any final conclusions or comments that you want to make, but I want to thank you, Perry and Barry, for the opportunity to be a part of this, and I would be happy to do it anytime that you'd like.
Well, thank you, Gary. These webinars, the preceding one that Eric was instrumental in helping put together, and the forthcoming one on the energy economy and the role of technologies will be forthcoming next week as we work toward a wrap up on the 23rd of December on a sustainable economy and sustainable energy policy. But I want to thank you, Gary. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Jan, Gordon, and Lou, of course. But let me make a couple of cogent observations. Jeff made it very apparent that one of the fundamental issues we'll be facing is the managing of the energy transition. If we go too fast, we run into volatility issues. If we go too slow, we've got the climate change issue facing us. So the managing of that transition takes us into the realm, as Gordon has pointed out so well, of politics. Agri-foods and a rapidly growing world population, particularly in Indo-Asia, means we also face the risks of food security. We all know how painful that can be. So we have both energy and food security issues facing us, both in economies that Canada excels in. Canada could be the buffer. Canada could be the world's buffer on issues of volatility, given our energy capability and our agri-foods capability. And I think when we look for policy, or we look for a pathway to a sustainable energy, economics, and environmental future, we've got to think about the role that Canada could play in help managing the buffer and reduce the risk of volatility. But that means diplomacy. And Lou, you made an extremely important point about how China feels about itself and how the world feels about China. And those sensitivities are worldwide. I mean, not just about China, there's sensitivities about Russia, the Ukraine, Iran, the United States, you name it. Diplomacy will play a fundamental role in reducing the risks associated with the volatility that we face coming into the future. We can't ignore the politics. While we've said that markets dominate, the reality is politics can mess it up royally. So I'm going to leave it that as a wrap up.